Prior to Plato, the philosophers that existed in ancient Greece can be put into two groups. The writings of the pre-Socratics, so-called because they came before Socrates, are only known in fragments. The pre-Socratics, starting with Thales of Miletus in the 6th century BC, created speculation about the nature of reality, having to do with the chemical table of the elements that was known at the time: earth, air, fire, and water. He thought that ultimately everything was reducible to water. Thales is also credited with the command of "know thyself," and with having predicted a solar eclipse. The most famous of the group is Pythagoras, due to his theorem about the sides of triangles being taught in schools. A particularly influential figure was Heraclitus, known for his statement that one cannot step into the same river twice. His theory was that everything was ultimately fire, the element of change, and that everything is in flux regardless of how stable everything seems. By contrast, Parmenides held that the way of truth is that reality is the one, an unchanging unity. This sets up an early clash of ideas that are seemingly contradictory and mutually compatible. Though their theories may seem primitive to us familiar with modern science, the pre-Socratics should be looked upon as the first to use the individual human mind in an attempt to explain the world around us with an eye toward objective validity, rather than looking to follow or create religious myths. The second group of Plato's predecessors, with whom he was acquainted as a young man, were the teachers of his day. Plato would always remain an admirer of his own teacher Socrates, and a critic of a group of other teachers known as the Sophists. The Sophists were a group who taught the art of rhetoric. Their promise to their students was to make them better orators for the purposes of persuasion. When hired by someone, these rhetoricians could then speak to promote the interests of their client by persuading people to believe whatever would serve their interests. This was in the context of a direct democracy, where the persons entitled to vote would vote in the laws rather than electing representatives to do it for them. The arguably most notable and respected of the Sophists was Protagoras, noted for his statement that man is the measure of all things. For instance, as a man of average height, I will seem tall to short people, and I will seem short to tall people. In terms of his own doctrine, it is debatable whether or not Protagoras actually extended this into a kind of relativism that would say that the truth is always as it seems to every individual, such that a true proposition for one might be false for another. We do know, however, that Plato did seek to refute a version of this idea that he attributed Protagoras. Socrates never wrote anything, and the only reason we know anything about him is because other writers have mentioned him: Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes, and others. He lived from 470 BC to 399 BC in Athens, where he was executed for not believing in the gods recognized by the state and poisoning the minds of young people. His main beliefs, known to be his, are that the unexamined life is not worth living, and a skepticism about claims to knowledge. He is known for the statement, "I know that I know nothing." What he meant by that in action is that he doubted people could be certain that their beliefs were really true, but he did have his own beliefs that he admitted he could not prove. He figures prominently in the dialogues of Plato, and when he goes beyond this skepticism into positive doctrine, he is commonly thought to be Plato's mouthpiece, voicing Plato's idea. In accordance with his beliefs, Socrates did not charge fees to his students and criticized the Sophists for doing so. What he would do is to seek out the company of intelligent people and engage them in conversation about their beliefs. When posing a question, such as what is virtue or what is knowledge, he will reject as inadequate any answer that is an example. He wants instead a definition or statement of the essence of a thing. For instance, regarding virtue, it would be what makes an act virtuous. that all virtuous acts have in common, that is not present in an act that is not virtuous. In the case of a river, it would be what all rivers have in common, which is not present in mountains, seas, pigs. He would then seek to define and clarify their theory, then proceed to subject the theory to criticism and show that it was not really known to be true. He is thought to have done this with the sophists who were his contemporaries, although to what degree Plato's dialogues accurately represent the conversations is always debatable. In his subject matter, Socrates was concerned with issues of virtue and justice, and thus with him begins the turn toward ethics in philosophy. His most famous pupil was Aristocles of Athens, living from 420 BC to 348 BC, who wrote under the pen name of Plato. Plato himself came from one of the wealthier families of Athens and was admired for his wrestling abilities as a youth. In addition to being a prolific writer in his adult years, he is also the founder of his own school, the Academy, of which Aristotle is the most famous graduate. Unlike Socrates, Plato had some confidence that men can gain knowledge with certainty. This was not disputed about mathematics and its ability to yield eternal and unchanging truths that are true for all. Plato is interested in the question of how we may obtain similar knowledge of the good. The sophists grated against his beliefs that there was some objectively valid moral good. It seemed their idea of developing the art of rhetoric would always be coupled with a kind of moral relativism that would hold that right depends on one's perspective, or even that justice is the interests of the stronger ruling party, or, in other words, might makes right. In much of his work, it seems important to Plato to refute such doctrines and replace them with his own, among them that he who harms another does damage even to his own soul. Plato thus creates a turn to epistemology in philosophy, like Socrates turned it toward ethics. Plato's Republic has a strange quirk about it, in that even though there is much talk about politics within it, it really is about justice as a state of mind within the individual, the soul of the just person. It has a plot in terms of how the conversations shift and transition from one subject to another. The important question asked early on is, what is justice? A few participants give different answers to the question. The elder host, Cephalus, proposes that it is honesty and paying one's debts, to give what is owed to others. Socrates responds with a counterexample. If a man borrows a weapon from me, and while he has it I go mad, he might then not be obliged to give back the weapon that I might use against him. A young man, Polemarchus, proposes alternatively that justice is treating others appropriately, so that one does good for friends and harm to enemies. Socrates countered that harming someone will make him unjust, and therefore it cannot be just because it would create more injustice. The sophist Thrasymachus interrupts, objecting to the rambling about what people deserve, because according to him, we all know that justice is the interests of the stronger ruling party, because in practice, that is all that gets called justice. Socrates proposes several objections, with Thrasymachus continuing to counter. The conversation reaches an impasse with Thrasymachus withdrawing without conceding anything, and with others, including Plato's brother Glaucon, expressing disappointment with Socrates. They would like to hear Socrates give his alternative definition, and also to give an account of how being a just man can be preferable to being an unjust man. Under the conception of Thrasymachus, the man trying to obtain justice through virtuous conduct is fooling himself because it is more profitable to be what Socrates calls unjust, and they want Socrates to explain and give a fuller refutation. At this point, Plato's brother Glaucon will be the main figure in conversation with Socrates. Socrates then proposes to shed light on what constitutes justice by looking first at what constitutes justice within the city-state, using it as a clue for determining justice within the individual. Justice both in the state and in the individual will both turn out to be a harmony of the three different parts, which will match three virtues of wisdom, courage, and temperance. The parts of the state will be the rulers, the guardians, who are the military or police, and a collection of citizens called producers and auxiliaries. The rulers are to exhibit in the state the virtue of wisdom, while we want guardians to be courageous, and the others to exhibit temperance. In the just state, these groups keep to the performance of their own separate functions. Moving on to the individual, the virtues of wisdom, courage, and temperance will be exhibited by the three parts of the soul: the rational part, the spirited part, and the appetitive part. Reason will be the wise ruler of the other two parts. The spirited part, the one analogous to the guardians, should not be thought of as spiritual in a religious sense. It is more like a sense of honor when you are pushed on the chest and experience an automatic desire to push back. The appetitive part refers to physical desires. In the just individual, each part serves its function in harmony with each other by allowing themselves to be guided by reason. For justice in the individual, we have identified the ruler, the rational part of the soul. But for the state, who is the ruler? As with reason being the most fit to govern the individual, Plato believes the ideal state should be ruled by he who is best fit to rule, namely the philosopher. At about the midway point in the Republic, we will now join the discussion between Socrates and Glaucon. We will start with the idea of the philosopher king. Glaucon asks the formidable question of whether the ideal state could ever actually exist. Socrates reminds Glaucon that they discussed earlier what a perfect man might be like, with the purpose being to show an ideal pattern. Glaucon agreed that it would not matter if such a man never actually exists. Likewise, Glaucon agrees that the theory of an ideal state is no worse if it cannot be proved that it would be possible. The purpose of considering it is that the ideal state as a thought can be something that guides toward perfection. Two rhetorical questions occur that exhibit Plato's thought about the relationship between theory and practice. Can theory ever be realized in practice? Is it not in the nature of things that actions should come less close to the truth than thought? If Plato is right, this means that it is a reasonable goal to attempt to bring practice, in the case of the state, in the closest accordance with the ideal. The reasons he gives for this is that thought is closer to perfection, so it is action that should be altered to fit, and not serve as a guide to thought. In other words, thought should not look to simply describe what actions exist, but to prescribe what actions may be at least better, if not perfect. Plato has in mind a significant and controversial change in mind to bring the state closer to perfection. He states, "Unless philosophers become kings in their countries, or those who are called kings or rulers come to be sufficiently inspired with the genuine desire for wisdom, unless, that is to say, political power and philosophy meet together. There can be no rest from troubles, my dear Glaucon, for states, nor yet, as I believe, all mankind, nor can the commonwealth, which we have imagined, ever till then see the light of day and grow to its full stature. But why not a democracy when it might seem simpler to reform the systems that his Athens had? The people, Plato will argue, have belief rather than knowledge, and are thereby not fit to govern. Plato now seeks a definition of the philosopher, this lover of wisdom. We only call someone a lover of something if he loves it as a whole, and everything of that type. The lover of wisdom that would be fit to rule would therefore be one who has a passion for all wisdom, and not some part of it. He must have a taste for every sort of knowledge. Now there are many seekers of wisdom, in the arts for instance, who will not engage in philosophical discussion. Our genuine philosopher will have a passion to see the truth. Plato's theory will be a theory of two worlds. Our philosopher will be concerned with the world of the true, the beautiful, and the good, and not be concerned with the world that only contains semblances of them. Beauty and ugliness are opposites, as well as justice and injustice, good and evil. Plato says this is something true of all essential forms. They manifest themselves in a great variety of combinations, with actions, physical things, attributes of things, and each other, while each in itself is one. And so there are many beautiful and ugly things, and also beauty as such, and ugliness as such. Given this, we can now distinguish our philosopher king from the great masses. There are many who can and will take delight in beautiful tones and colors, but without thought to behold and delight in the nature of beauty itself. Plato asks of the person who believes in the existence of beautiful things, but not of beauty itself, is he not living in a dream? Plato believes that he is effectively living in a dream, whether actively sleeping or awake, because his reality is a semblance of a true reality that it resembles. Our philosopher, by contrast, believing that beauty itself exists, will seek to discern the essence of beauty, what beauty as such is, as well as the particular things that partake of its character without confusing the two. Now let's pause a minute here. Did Plato just talk about beauty as such having existence, being some kind of entity? Actually, yes, he did. Like Pythagoras before him, Plato believed in reincarnation, or the transmigration of souls. And so, even though he would admit that beauty as such does not exist on earth, apart from being an attribute of beautiful things, there is another place he has in mind wherein such a thing can exist. Beauty and all other forms exist in a supersensible reality to which we have access between separate lifetimes. Consequently, for Plato, it does not have to be limited to a question of whether beauty as such exists as an earthbound entity or whether its existence is just in our minds as a concept. Plato is establishing here his theory that true knowledge of universals that he calls ideas or forms, rather than that of particulars, is the knowledge of true or higher reality. It is better to have the concept or form of a thing, be it an apple, chair, justice, truth, the good, than to just have familiarity with particular instances of those things. Particular things will partake of their forms, meaning that every apple or chair will exhibit what it means to be an apple or chair, but will do so along with its own particular attributes that are not essential. Plato believes this is true knowledge of the nature of appleness, and likewise of virtue, justice, the good, that are exhibited in all and only virtuous, just, and good actions. then we can have a criterion to judge new or ambiguous actions. He believes that for all of these things and attributes for which we have names, all exist as archetypes in a supersensible world that is the real one. The philosopher will be concerned with the world of real objects that will turn out to be the objects of knowledge. Ignorance, the opposite of knowledge, has no object. Between knowledge and ignorance, we find another possibility in the form of belief. Plato's argument will now turn to finding an object of belief. It would be absurd for us to suggest that we know something that is false, and therefore the object of knowledge must always be real. But belief is sometimes true and sometimes false. If the object of knowledge is the purely real, and the object of ignorance is the purely unreal, what would be the object of belief? Plato believes he has a clue. If something both is and is not, then it can lie between extremes of what is purely real and purely unreal, like belief lies between knowledge and ignorance. So we now have an object for each of the three faculties, as Plato calls them. For the faculty of knowledge, we have the purely real object. For the faculty of ignorance, we have the object that is not, and for the faculty of belief, we have the object that is and is not. But what does Plato mean when he talks about something that is and is not? Anything may appear both beautiful and ugly in some way. Things that are called heavy or large may be small or light by other people, or in comparison to different sets of objects. A belief that apples are red will be true of some, but not all apples. It is also true of justice and the good that actions may seem one way or the other. In the case of justice, Plato has already established that he regards justice as paying one's debts as part of the realm of belief, because that principle will sometimes be true and sometimes false. These beliefs about relative terms like large, or about what seems to be true under particular circumstances, or from a perspective, are beliefs about things that change. The large object becomes small in the eyes of the larger person, or in comparison to larger objects. That red apple is red when ripe, and will become brown if not eaten. That act of returning the borrowed weapon seems not so just or honorable if the loaner has gone mad in the interim, but seems reasonable under most circumstances. So Plato tells us the many conventional notions of the mass of mankind about what is beautiful or honorable, or just, and so on, are adrift in a sort of twilight between pure reality and pure unreality. And so to have knowledge, we are to contemplate the reality of things as they are forever in some unchanging state. So far, Plato has created a hierarchy of cognitive functions in which knowledge is superior to belief, which is superior to ignorance. This occurs within a discussion of what our future philosopher king will study. We would count him to have knowledge, but what is the best knowledge for him to have? His knowledge should be about what is good and desirable, because there is no advantage in knowing everything else but what is good and desirable. As for what the good as such is, Socrates refuses to tell Glaucon, stating that in his case it is only opinion and not knowledge, and thus Plato is not defining it for us here. However, he is willing to do what he calls delivering an offspring of the good, that is, the sun. Plato's analogy that he is here building will be that just as the sun makes visible objects visible to us, goodness as such will make knowledge of the good intelligible. It is only through light that we can see anything, and thus form belief about what we see, while darkness keeps us in ignorance. In fading light, colors dim as the light dims. None of the other senses has a third visible thing, allowing a sense organ to perceive another object. If we apply this analogy to the soul, The form or essential nature of the good is what allows the soul to gain understanding and knowledge. The soul's gaze is then fixed upon an object lit up by truth and reality. By contrast, Plato says, when it looks toward that twilight world of things that come into existence and pass away, its sight is dim, and it has only opinions and beliefs which shift to and fro. The form of goodness, like the sun with vision, is the cause of knowledge and truths, and is also something different and apart from it. The good will thus hold a higher status or worth. Plato extends his analogy to the sun even further. The sun not only makes things visible, it also gives growth and nourishment. Likewise, objects of knowledge are derived from the good, not only in their ability to be known, but also in their very existence and reality. Plato has now set up his two worlds, one that is visible to us on earth, and another that is only intelligible from it. The sun lights up the visible world, and the form of the good lights up the intelligible world. Now Plato will describe how different types of cognition apply to the different worlds in his analogy of the line. Our sense experience that we use to become familiar with things around us will not be sufficient for obtaining knowledge of the objects of the intelligible world. The analogy of the line has us imagine 4 levels of mental activity that will have a corresponding level of truth and reality. The first 2 levels, imagining and belief, will be applicable to the world of appearances. The cognitive functions of thinking and knowledge will have objects in the intelligible world. At the lowest levels of imagining, we have images that can have examples of dim images, shadows, reflections on water. It can also include the thoughts that we call speculation and guessing. Its object will be images. Going into the second level, we have the cognitive function of belief, where we have the higher of the 2 realities of the visible world. Belief has visible things as its object, clearly visible to us. However, like images, they are still subject to change. Transitioning now into the intelligible world, we have next the activity of thinking. What Plato has in mind here specifically is mathematical thinking that postulates assumptions and draws conclusions from them, as mathematicians do in geometry. The propositions they draw will be true along with their assumptions, but they do not question their assumptions. The objects of thinking is intellectual objects. Though they may draw straight lines, circles, triangles for illustration purposes, it is understood that those are only visual aids and representations of perfect and unchanging things that are not of the visible world. At the top of the line, we have the cognitive function of intelligence and knowledge, whose object is the forms. Like thinking, knowledge will also feature abstract thinking in its method about an object that is eternal and unchanging. However, Plato regards the proper method of knowledge to be his method of dialectic. By this he means no more than the question and answer of philosophical dialogue in which he wrote. Through dialectic, we pose a hypothesis and seek an account of it and its consequences through a kind of logos or discourse. In doing so, we may fail to give an adequate account, but when we succeed, we move upward as well to first principles, while the geometer will never move above the assumptions that he does not test. At this point, Plato's theory of forms has been expressed. Real knowledge is knowledge of concepts, of essences, that exist as archetypes in a supersensible reality. Plato seeks to also illustrate his theory of forms with the famous allegory of the cave. Imagine if we were all prisoners in a cave, chained to the floor, and facing a wall throughout our lives without knowing it. The world as we know it is actually images that we see projected upon the wall that we face. Outside of the cave, these images that we see are created by a fire providing the light. In front of the fire are the objects of the real world, and their shadows are projected onto the wall. The world that we take to be real is in fact a show of the shadows of the real objects. Those outside of the cave, be they gods or souls in between incarnations, will be able to see the real objects being projected onto the wall of the cave by the light of the fire. Should our future philosopher king manage to escape the cave and enter the world of light, he, however, would be temporarily blinded and would not immediately discover the nature of the illusion. Logically, the allegory of the cave serves the function of arguing a theory in the philosophy of education, namely that future leaders should learn mathematics before learning about the good, in order to have the intellect gradually adjust itself to the light of the understanding of the intelligible world. Many people would give more emphasis on the allegory of the cave because the Republic can also be analyzed as a work of literature with some ingenious imagery, whereas I am describing it in logical terms of its arguments. Plato's originality shown in the Theory of Forms is one in which he creates a combination of what he agrees with in the theories of his predecessors. For the world of belief we see around us, he agrees with Heraclitus that it is a world of constant change. The world of the forms will be the recognition to Parmenides and the truth of his unchanging permanence being true of our concepts. In terms of criticism, the idea that true knowledge is of concepts can be and is accepted without believing that our concepts exist. Philosophers after Plato have given his theory this partial acceptance. Just because we can name something does not mean that it must exist as an object outside of our minds. I would also argue that we do in fact have some knowledge of particular things. I see this pen at this time as being golden in color and writing in black ink. I believe it is knowledge of this particular pen. This not being knowledge of all pens does not render this to be a mere belief about this pen. However, this does not necessarily mean that Plato's theory in its entirety must fall. It does mean there is a hole in his chart, a wrong term, or just an inadequate account where he has belief on the line. Plato can still validly argue that my pen is subject to change, and he is also right to state that I wouldn't have bought it if it didn't match my conception of a pen. So would I want a philosopher to be the king of my country? Well, I would not mind voting for one to be a representative of the legislature, but to be king, I would certainly not want Plato. And to find out why, read Plato's Republic. I recommend it. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thanks for watching.